I used to walk home from school through the cemetery and hop the fence into my backyard, saving myself much time and effort from having to go the long way around taking the street. This was always cause for a stroll through the outdoor mausoleum, to wonder on the architecture, how it looked so different from the usual buildings of a city, and to look at the names and dates, often thinking about how private it all seemed. The white marble walls were quite profound to me. They tantalized me with symmetries that whispered the inexplicable, the inexorable subtleties of death. Yet in the same instance, such mystery would be offset by their service to the human condition. Each square fitted with some generic wall-mounted vase for flowers, vases that were often empty or stuffed with plastic substitutes. Every once in a while, a fresh bouquet would materialize, signaling that someone had paid a visit, though for some reason I rarely saw anyone actually visiting. I always seemed to be the only one there, the stillness always drawing me into a thoughtful mood. And after my interest waned, I would walk until the open cemetery itself came into view, the panorama of tombstones filling the periphery of my vision. One day, in the brightness of a springtime sun, I saw in the short distance a rectangular hole dug in the ground. It was unattended to, and a sheet of plywood was pulled back from the opening, as if someone would be back at any moment to put it back into position. I looked around to see if anybody was seeing what I was seeing, but I was alone. And the hole affected me for some reason. I couldn't allow myself to approach it. I just stood there. It was the first time I'd ever felt some sort of reaction to the notion that the cemetery might be a place where something more than peace and harmony could exist. I didn't feel an immediate sense of danger, but I didn't feel safe. A soft breeze blew through the eucalyptus trees. Birds were flying around here and there. Cars were moving back and forth on the street behind me. And there I was, captivated by the presence of a freshly dug hole in the ground, which seemed to be exerting energy to keep my attention. I passed it by. I hopped the fence and I went to that bedroom of mine, in that house where I lived. I was done with my homework by the time one of the other family members had gotten home. It meant that the darkening of the evening was upon us. The two of us not paying any attention to each other, I watched television for a while in the little room next to mine. The sky turned purple, then black through the westward window as I lost interest in the programming and was compelled to lie down, a sense of listlessness overcoming my mind and body. I didn't feel like reading, so I just lay there in the dark, looking at the stars poking in from above the towering eucalyptus row. My room wasn't completely dark because of the street lamp just outside my window, a tall pole with a curved bar that extended at a right angle from the top. At the tip, a neon bulb was like a languid eye that never seemed to go away. The fluorescent orange glow flooded the immediate area of the court below, where the sidewalk went round in a circle forming a dead end, the homes of my neighbors lining the way. The place seemed tucked away from the rest of the world, where the cemetery surrounding us formed a gulf of blackness beyond. Maybe I was falling into a dream world, but embedded within the orange rays as they streamed in from my window, landing on the wood grains of my closet doors, I saw a black figure. Hooded and without a face, it just stood there, looking in my direction. The edges of its cloak moved about in slow, continuous waves. Darkness grew from it until it vanished, and I began to rise from the bed and drift. Then darkness was everywhere, and I began to see people that were grotesquely thin and white. I thought they were skeletons, but they were not. They had flesh, just very little of it, so that the ghostliness of their skin wrapped tightly to their bones. They were painful to observe, their faces molded by expressions of misery, their eyes in a daze and looking past me. As they moved, seemingly hovering along like slow-moving bodily projectiles, I could hear strange moaning sounds, sometimes even a yell. They were passing me by and I tried to see where they were going, but I couldn't move my head. And so they steadily went, leaving me in one direction and I in the other. In time, the last of these figures began to dissipate so that they were no more, and I saw a white speck in the blackness before me. For the longest time, I thought it was a solitary star as I approached. I felt incredibly alone, but it didn't bother me because I was used to the feeling. The speck then began to assume a shape I could recognize. It was a tiny rectangle that grew and grew, and I kept flying towards it, closer and closer. Eventually, I saw that it was like a window with light peering through, and my curiosity pulled me along like a magnet. Still surrounded everywhere by an ocean of pitch black, it grew larger and larger until I was stopped and could go no further. The rectangle was not a window, but an opening just larger than the size of my body. I found myself situated just below it, looking straight into the deep blue sky, as though the entire time I had not been moving, but rising, with my back to the center of the earth. I was unable to control my actions, yet I continued to move upwards, very slowly, until I was able to breach the plane of vision. On all four sides at my feet, next to my arms, above my head, there were dirt walls. They were the walls of a grave, and I saw people standing, looking down on me. They were dressed in black, and I recognized many of the faces. Some of the women were crying, while others, they were staring in somber contemplation. The men, by contrast, kept their faces to their feet, devoid of emotional expression. One by one, they began to leave as the sun set, until I was left alone in the night, a wide canopy of stars evolving and curving into every direction. Asterisms abounded within the density of those stellar pinpricks, and a plummeting meteorite drew a long crystalline line that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Before a copper moon that glowed through the trees, I began to rise again, as though some magician were performing an act of levitation. My prostrate body rose just above the level of the earth, where the depths of blackness remained behind me. As though I'd been released from a spell, I was finally able to move. From having my back to the rectangular hole to becoming upright, I saw the cemetery around me as I stood, at the very spot which had so filled me with dread coming home from school. The moon now crept above the trees, and I turned around to face the west, to observe the location of my home. In this path of sight, the tombstones stretched out in myriad uniformity, glowing like electrified placards of the dead. I let my gaze fall back to the hole from where I had emerged, the gaping blackness moaning with the wind that blew around me. I was cold, but I failed to shiver. I lifted my head to try and discern the fence that wrapped around the homes of the court where I lived. There I sensed the presence of my neighbors, their windows darkened by the nature of the midnight hour. I began to walk, and I could sense the dampness of the grass. Names everywhere filled my sight, passing me by, and I wondered about each and every one of them. That is, until I began nearing the home of Angela. Though I hardly had the chance to know her, I always thought about Angela. When we had moved in, I looked out my window the first day I woke up in my bedroom and was intrigued by the overarching view I had of our court. I was on the second story, and I remember seeing Angela across the street, the morning mist causing her to hold her robe tightly around her neck. She was reattaching the fallen half of a real estate sign plotted in the ivy of her neighbor's yard, and I saw that we could have been the same age. Her delicate hands and her auburn hair, her milky white skin, her wine-colored lips, I couldn't take my eyes off of her. I felt a surge of adrenaline when she checked her surroundings, and then she turned and looked directly at me. I should have smiled, maybe even waved, but I stepped back. I thought the glare might be protecting me from being seen, so I kept standing there, watching her stare at my window. Our gaze remained locked, but I couldn't figure out what she was up to. I was a statue, determined not to be detected, and eventually she turned around and went back inside. And now I was approaching her home, and I found myself at her window. My feet were no longer touching the ground. The space between her curtains allowed for a heavenly sight, her seraphic face buried into a soft pillow, her eyes closed, her mind caught in the drama of some unknown dream. I tapped on the window, realizing my fingers were like sharpened points of glass, because the tapping sound had been so crystal clear. She awoke immediately, looking in my direction with wide hazel eyes. I caught them and kept them, and she rose from the bed to open the curtains. I could feel my jaws clenching as she looked at me. With the breeze, I seeped into the room. The sound of her breathing was in my ear, and I caught her scent as I felt her hair between the surfaces of our skin. Her fingernails edged along my back, and for every ounce of effort I expended to take her, she took me. I felt the spirit of the divine in our passion, in our soaking kisses, and in the movement of our bodies, and I felt what I always thought love was intended to define. Something more than eternity was ours, and I closed my eyes, the warmth of her heavenly flesh inflaming the gulf where my empty soul had sought to reside. Then I sensed a flash of anguish before I felt her go limp in my arms, her neck going wet with blood. Glimmering ruby streams cascaded into the curves of her chest. Life was extinguished, and I rose, gazing on the scene in something akin to shock, her body sprawled in the deluge of her blood-soaked bed. The feeling of helplessness ran strong, and yet I could only hover there, as though captivated by an act I had no control in committing. I vanished from her room and found myself standing beneath the towering street lamp in front of my house. The cold air blew on the red wetness of my face so that the mess began to dry. I looked up at my window, a rectangular dimension of black reflecting an orange sheen. Was someone in there looking at me? I turned around and looked in the direction of Angela's house, only to observe the silence of inactivity around me, that late hour when people sleep, leaving the streets wide open for those who only know how to roam. I looked up at the eucalyptus trees moving about like giants, their leaves rustling in the windy noise. I returned my gaze to her house, and a tear fell from my eye. Next morning I woke knowing as usual, the other people of the house were already gone. Most of my childhood had been that way, every morning waking alone, every night eating something by myself. I instantly recalled the dream and felt my mouth had been wet from dripping saliva. After coming back from the bathroom, from dousing my head under a shower of cold water, I dried my hair with a towel, opening the curtains of my window. Alarm struck me with quickness. Flashing red lights, police cars, an ambulance. What was going on at Angela's house? I thought about the dream and had to wonder. It was a wild one indeed, but that's all it was, just a dream. Maybe something was going on with her parents, or maybe it was her grandfather. He did seem as though he were a little too active in his elderly condition, his old frame always moving about the yard, picking at the weeds. I didn't have any time to ponder the matter, but the scene of emergency response stuck in my head all day long. When I got to that point in my day, where I took the shortcut home through the cemetery after school, the plywood at the open grave was still there, only this time it was covering the hole. Someone had attended to it. As was typical, I didn't see anyone around, and because it was covered this time, I was struck with the courage to move closer. The plywood had wet dirt clods stuck to the face, and its edges were frayed with dry rot. I looked around the cemetery. No one. I looked back and noticed a worm crawling through one of the larger clods, and I noticed how the sheet didn't quite cover the entirety of the hole. I could see a thin slice of airy black. I was tempted to reach down and lift, where the black slice would have allowed the perfect space for my fingers to fit. I felt the grimness of the gray sky above, the sunlight blocked by thin clouds, the expanse of the dead bathed in a dull and melancholy haze. Then someone's loud car made me jump, bursting with a sudden rage of noise down the street behind me. Startled and jittery, I took myself away fast, hopping the fence into my backyard. Downstairs in my house, an unused living room had a large window with long, heavy curtains bearing the design of something like a white and green paisley pattern. I pulled them back to see if anything was going on. A police car lingered. I figured that if the police had been there all day, then someone might be coming by to ask questions. I let the curtains fall shut and went about my routine, glancing through the windows every once in a while, until I noticed the police car was finally gone. Within a few days, the news became known to everyone in the neighborhood. Angela had committed suicide, and no one really knew why. I was shocked. I felt sickly when I heard, and had trouble processing the situation. From the moment I first saw her, I'd hoped to get to know her, but I was such a shy person. It wasn't that I didn't actually know her. We had met and spoken a few times. I just wasn't able to act on my feelings. Could I have saved her if I had gotten to know her better sooner? I was angry. I had let my heartstrings form an attachment she never even knew about. I was hoping on somehow creating the circumstances in which I would get to spend time with her. Or I might have hung out with her during the winter vacation, when it wasn't unusual for one of the neighbors to invite everyone over for a Christmas party. Now, she was gone, and I was feeling it. Another week passed, and the world was empty. The other people of my family came home late and they left early, and I made my meals and did my homework. I watched television, drew pictures, read some books, and strummed my guitar. When I slept, I no longer dreamed for the longest time. But that changed one night when I found myself immensely tired, falling asleep fast yet again by the street lamp glow. I was walking home from school in the middle of the night. The fog was thick, and I was making my way through the streets towards the cemetery to take advantage of the shortcut as I always did. Residential homes were dark, and the street lamps followed me into my dream, drenched in fog, and they seemed to bring forth human shapes in the windows as I passed. I came to the cemetery entrance, its black iron gates bolted to brick columns. Without the moon, the tombstone rows became dark perforated lines overlapping the darker shades of the earth, where the mist clung in formless sheets. I walked along the asphalt path towards my house for as long as it would allow until, as I was accustomed to, I would be forced to walk through the grass in order to complete my journey. And I saw the plywood sheet between me and my destination. I beheld its presence, trying to process all that it could mean, and I began to walk closer. When I stood at the base of it, I saw the black slice, the space where my fingers could fit if I desired to move it. I reached down and felt the mucky edge. Then I heard crying, realizing, good God, was somebody in there? I moved the sheet aside and saw Angela lying on her side in the dirt. Her crying was a distressful sound, and though she had been looking at a wall of fresh clay mud, she turned and looked up at me, her beautiful face ever so distraught.
It's so lonely,
she lamented. It's so
lonely in here.
To see her like this, to hear her like this was unbearable. I jumped in, and we looked at each other as though the impossible were possible. Surrounded by dirt, we kissed, the foggy night staring down at us from the rectangular opening above. I ran my fingers through her hair, and she put her head back to look at me for a moment. Please don't leave me behind in this place. A fresh tear fell as she closed her eyes. I can't take it. Please don't leave me here all alone. Her suffering was torturous to behold, and I held her like I would never let go. Her sadness turned to passion so that our love lit like a flame that I couldn't allow to be extinguished. We kissed until her tears seemed to agitate the skin of my face. We looked into each other and felt each other's bodies, and I saw the glimpse of a smile that made my blood rush. Then the earth began to crumble beneath us. We fell into an abyss, and the rectangular hole began to drift away high above. I held on to her as tight as I could, her innocent smile forever imprinting into my mind. But a look of terror shot across her face as her body began to pull away from mine, and she began to fall faster than me. No! She cried out. We held hands for as long as we could until she fell completely away. The last thing I remember was her solemn plea, begging me not to forsake her, before her expression turned vapid as she disappeared into the void. I awoke with the feeling like I'd been emotionally wounded. My eyes were wet, and I turned on my side to look at the floor. I felt a deep sense of loss. I saw Angela's image burning in my thoughts, her body falling as I was lifted into the waking world. She had died, but she was calling me from beyond. I had seen where she was, and I realized she needed me. I went downstairs and proceeded to consider breakfast. But instead of making anything, I looked around the kitchen, then to the family room, where a large television console sat in the corner in front of a couple of recliners. The thing was hardly ever on. Nobody was ever around, yet Angela was calling me in my dreams. But weren't dreams sometimes depictions of reality, only dressed as fictive illusion? Contrarily, dreams were sometimes hardly fictive at all. They told people plainly what needed to happen. And Angela had made it all as clear as the ringing of a cast-iron bell. When the time came for me to put on my clothes and head to school, I neglected to act. I felt drained and uninterested, empty and unfeeling. No one had ever made me feel like Angela did. I would give anything to have her in my arms. Should I die, our spirits would invariably connect. The flame that was kindled would light the way. I remembered how she had beckoned me, falling away into the deep, and I realized that if I didn't go to her, she would be abandoned to the world of the dead, all alone, forever. She gave her heart to me and disappeared, taken by the chasm that separates life from death, and I became determined to prove my love for her. What was there for me at home anyways? No one was ever there. No one ever met me when I came home, to ask how I was doing, to wonder how things were going. It was a drab, lonely life that didn't even seem worth living. And Angela, she was lost to just as much loneliness in a world I could only visit if I had the chance of dreaming about her. But too much time had passed from the day she died to that of my latest dream. The intervals would grow, and eventually she would be lost for all eternity. The thought was intolerable. Lying in bed, staring at the white and crumbly texture of my ceiling, the images began to form. And I could sense Angela's voice echoing in my mind, how she'd pleaded for me to be with her. My head began to hurt from thinking about it. I got up and sat at the edge of the bed, where I could see Angela's house in plain view. She would never emerge from that front door again. I went downstairs. The squeaking of the door leading to the garage disrupted the quietness, an atmosphere laced with the notion that I was supposed to be in school at the moment. The workbench had a slightly used look to it, though it was, nevertheless, organized with an unused feel. I was the only one ever in there, grabbing tools on the weekend to get the gardening done for the other people who lived in the house. I opened the cabinet doors and found plastic bottles lined up like expensive wines, ready for the taking, their labels inked with skull and crossbones denoting the desired effect. I had to go back inside and get a glass, where I also managed a liter of grape juice. Back at the bench, toxic odors infiltrated the membranes of my nose, the grape juice quelling some of the offense. The tall glass stood there, brown and purple colors swirling, a wisp of white rising after I stirred it well with a silver spoon. The uselessness of my life had been the antithesis to living, but the grave had helped me, had led me to discover my ultimate cause, to end the days of my solitude, and to find peace in the act of devoting my life to someone who truly needed me for a change.